A landlocked nation with dust on its roads and calloused hands in its fields has just defied the might of Washington. Burkina Faso, often dismissed as a minor player, stood tall where others bent. When Donald Trump unleashed tariffs on Africa's backbone industries, gold, cocoa, cotton, and food staples, he expected silence. He expected desperation. Instead, he met defiance. At the center of the storm is Ibrahim Traoré, a leader barely 36 years old who blocked the tariff demands outright. He did not plead. He did not negotiate. He simply refused. And in that refusal, the ground shifted. This is not about percentages on trade papers. This is about dignity and the breaking of chains that have bound Africa for centuries. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a turning point history will remember. Subscribe and stand with us. Because the question before us is larger than tariffs, it is the question of sovereignty itself. If one small nation can say no, what stops the rest? And that is where the story begins, with a refusal that echoes far beyond Ouagadougou. Story opens with a weapon as old as empire, the tariff. For centuries, it has been the velvet glove over an iron fist, wielded whenever the rhetoric of partnership wore thin. When Donald Trump announced sweeping tariffs on African exports, the message was not subtle. It was pressure disguised as policy. Gold, cocoa, cotton, textiles, food staples, the very arteries of fragile economies were suddenly under siege. Washington calculated the outcome. Leaders panicking, scrambling for exemptions, bowing their heads. The pattern was familiar, rehearsed countless times before. But this time the script broke. From Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, came a voice that refused to follow the choreography of fear. Ibrahim Traoré did not ask for negotiations. He did not hedge his words. He declared openly that Burkina Faso would not mortgage its dignity for access to an American market built on shifting sands. For a continent used to hearing hesitation, his bluntness was electric. The tariffs themselves were not minor technicalities. They were designed as a hammer, striking at the foundations of Africa's trade. By targeting gold, Washington reached for the lifeblood of treasuries. By taxing cocoa and cotton, it struck at the livelihoods of farmers across West Africa. By squeezing food exports, it threatened both incomes and stability. This was not diplomacy. It was economic siege. And yet, within 72 hours, the expected collapse did not come. Instead, a coalition of 34 African nations rallied around Traoré's stance. Emergency trade agreements were activated like hidden seeds bursting through the soil after a long rain. Commodities were redirected eastwards, towards markets in Asia, Russia, and beyond. Gold shipments found refiners outside the Western financial system. Agricultural goods found eager buyers from India to Brazil. The continent, once thought to be trapped in dependency, showed it had prepared for exactly this test. In Ouagadougou, crowds filled the streets. Their cheers were not polite applause, but catharsis, an outpouring of pride long denied. They shouted Traoré's name not as the title of an office holder, but as a banner of defiance. For a landlocked country of 22 million, it was a roar that carried across borders. Meanwhile, in Washington, the mood was darker. Reports leaked of furious debates in the White House. Trump's advisors, blindsided by the speed of Africa's counter, scrambled to salvage authority. Sanctions were floated. Diplomatic isolation was discussed. But the humiliation had already landed. That an African nation, and not Nigeria, not South Africa, not Egypt, but Burkina Faso could simply say no, was an affront to the very logic of Western dominance. What made this moment seismic was not only the defiance itself, but what it symbolized. For decades, Africa was cast as a passive stage where outside powers wrote the script. Now the stagehands had seized the pen. The rejection of tariffs was no longer a mere policy decision. It was a declaration that sovereignty was not negotiable. This was why analysts began calling it a trade earthquake. For the West, the assumption that tariffs could bend nations at will was shattered. For Africa, the knowledge that unity could blunt pressure was intoxicating. For the world, it was the signal that multipolarity, once an academic phrase, had arrived in practice. Burkina Faso, overlooked for decades in Western narratives, had become the epicenter of global attention. The dust of Ouagadougou was suddenly the ground zero of a new story. And the shock was amplified by the speed, the clarity, the audacity. But if this was the explosion, then the aftershocks, the fury in Washington, the jubilation in Africa, the reverberations across continents, were only just beginning. The air in Ouagadougou was electric. Crowds surged into the streets not because a tariff had been blocked, but because an old cycle had finally been broken. For generations, African leaders had walked a tightrope between foreign pressure and domestic pride, and too often, the rope snapped under the weight of Western demands. Yet here stood Ibrahim Traoré, a man barely 36 who did not stumble. He spoke with the certainty of someone who believed sovereignty was not a bargaining chip. His words, "Africa will not beg, Africa will not kneel," cut through the noise of diplomacy like a blade through rope. The atmosphere was different from a typical political rally. This was not performance, it was release. The cheers were not rehearsed slogans but spontaneous catharsis, like a dam breaking after years of silent strain. Mothers carried children on their backs, farmers waved their hoes in the air, students lifted banners with his name scrawled across them. For once, Burkina Faso was not portrayed as fragile, but as unyielding. Meanwhile, in Washington, the mood was fury bordering on disbelief. Trump, who thrived on the image of dominance, could not tolerate the optics of defiance. Insiders reported nights of frantic meetings in the White House, advisors weighing retaliatory options, harsher sanctions, withdrawal of aid, diplomatic downgrades. Yet even as they scrambled, the humiliation deepened. It was not Nigeria with its oil reserves that had rejected Washington, not South Africa with its industry, not Egypt with its strategic weight. It was a so-called peripheral nation, and that stung even more. For Western media outlets, the story was awkward to frame. Some dismissed it as a reckless gamble by an inexperienced leader. Others acknowledged the symbolism, but downplayed the economic reality. Yet beneath the commentary, there was an unspoken recognition. Something had shifted. A continent once expected to comply had suddenly closed ranks. Across Africa, the symbolism traveled faster than the facts. In Lagos, commentators spoke of a new dawn. In Nairobi, columnists described Traoré as the leader who refused to kneel. In Johannesburg, headlines compared the defiance to South Africa's own anti-apartheid resistance. The emotional resonance mattered more than trade statistics. Sovereignty had been spoken out loud, and millions were listening. What amplified the moment was Traoré's youth. Older leaders, weathered by decades of compromise, often hesitated before challenging the West. But Traoré's defiance carried the freshness of someone unbound by the weight of old contracts. At 36, he had time on his side and nothing to lose by breaking away from a system that had failed his country. Critics abroad called it recklessness. Admirers at home called it courage. Either way, it was unforgettable, and the message extended beyond Africa. In Latin America, commentators pointed to the echo of sovereignty struggles against Washington. In Southeast Asia, analysts wondered whether small nations there might learn from Burkina Faso's stance. The question grew louder. If a country so often overlooked could resist, why not others? But there was also tension. Defiance is exhilarating, but it is also risky. Could Burkina Faso withstand the full brunt of American retaliation? Would the coalition of 34 nations hold if the pressure intensified? Would alternative markets remain open if Washington leaned harder on its allies? These questions haunted foreign ministries across the continent. Yet the exhilaration outweighed the fear. For Trump, the humiliation was personal. He had built his brand on the image of making America feared, on bending others with tariffs and ultimatums. To be defied so bluntly by a nation of 22 million, with no coastline and limited resources, was more than an inconvenience. It was a symbolic rupture. The optics were devastating. A strong man being told no by one of the world's so-called weakest players? In this collision, symbolism mattered more than spreadsheets. Tariffs were supposed to be the whip. Instead, they became the mirror, reflecting the fragility of Western dominance. And what shook Washington most was not just the defiance itself, but the possibility that it could spread. The question that now haunted every capital, from Abuja to Washington, was this: if Burkina Faso could resist, who would be next to slam the door on America? Defiance always carries consequences. In the days that followed Traoré's rejection of Washington's tariffs, Burkina Faso found itself standing in a new light. Admired by some, targeted by others. The immediate effect at home was a surge of legitimacy. Crowds that once questioned the future now spoke with renewed confidence. Farmers, miners, traders, those whose livelihoods were most vulnerable to tariffs, found hope in the knowledge that their leader had refused to bend. Pride became as valuable a currency as the gold beneath their soil. Yet beyond the chants and celebrations, real challenges loomed. The American tariffs did not vanish simply because they were rejected. Access to the U.S. market shrank overnight. Exporters who had long relied on American buyers were forced to scramble for alternatives. Some shipments sat stalled in warehouses, caught between canceled contracts and hurried new negotiations. Prices dipped in the short term. Tension rippled through local economies. For ordinary families, uncertainty was as palpable as pride. But what surprised analysts was the resilience. Within weeks, redirected trade flows began to soften the blow. Gold refiners in Moscow took in consignments once bound for New York. Agricultural goods rerouted to Asian markets began to move. India's demand for maize and pulses absorbed shocks that might otherwise have crippled rural incomes. Brazil's agribusiness sector opened channels for Burkina Faso's cotton and food staples. The message was clear. The country was not alone. Politically, the effect was even more dramatic. Ibrahim Traoré had risen to power in 2022 through what the West labeled a coup, but what many Burkinabés saw as a necessary rupture with a suffocating status quo. Now, 3 years later, his decision to confront Washington amplified that image of a leader who governed not by appeasement, but by assertion. The Ibrahim Traoré coup was no longer remembered simply as a military takeover. It was reframed as the birth of a doctrine: sovereignty first, negotiation second. Inside Parliament and the media, critics were not silent. Some questioned whether the risks outweighed the symbolism. Could Burkina Faso endure if the U.S. escalated? Would foreign investors flee? Yet those voices were drowned out by a public wave that valued dignity over dependency. In bars, in markets, in classrooms, conversations carried a new tone. If we can say no to Washington, then what else can we reclaim? The effect extended to the wider region. Leaders who had quietly followed the events began to sense a shift in public mood across Africa. In Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and Senegal, commentators noted the rising expectation that sovereignty could no longer be compromised without backlash. Traoré had set a precedent that even larger states could not ignore. Still, the risks were undeniable. Economic retaliation from Washington could deepen. Loans from Western financial institutions might be withheld. Aid packages could shrink. Yet for many in Burkina Faso, these threats were no longer paralyzing. Aid had long been seen as a cycle of dependency, where resources flowed out and conditions flowed in. By rejecting that bargain, Traoré redefined the narrative. It was no longer about begging for relief, but about charting an independent course, however rocky. Socially, the shift was profound. National pride translated into small but symbolic changes. Flags hung higher in markets. Patriotic songs were revived. Young people, once disillusioned by politics, began speaking of possibility. Pride did not put food on the table, but it provided the resilience to endure shortages, to accept temporary uncertainty in exchange for long-term sovereignty. Yet for all the optimism, shadows lingered. The threat of isolation remained. America still wielded influence through international institutions, and allies could be pressured to follow suit. Burkina Faso's choice was bold, but boldness is never without cost. The question hovering over every conversation was whether the coalition of 34 African nations that rallied so quickly would sustain its unity once the immediate crisis passed. Solidarity is powerful in the heat of defiance, but fragile in the cold arithmetic of economics. And so the country moved forward in duality, lifted by pride, but weighed by uncertainty. Defiance had brought dignity, but it had also brought risk. And in that balance lay the real test of Traoré's vision. Whether sovereignty could be more than a speech, whether it could endure as policy. But as Burkina Faso braced itself for the storm, the eyes of the world turned outward, to the international arena, where reactions would determine whether this act of defiance remained a local tremor or became a global earthquake. In Washington, humiliation turned quickly into calculation. What had begun as a trade maneuver was now a diplomatic crisis. The United States had expected compliance, yet within 72 hours, Burkina Faso had turned a tool of pressure into a banner of defiance. Allies watched carefully, and reactions revealed the cracks in the Western Front. Across the Atlantic, Europe hesitated. The European Union, still grappling with energy insecurity and wary of ceding Africa entirely to Beijing and Moscow, did not fully back Trump's tariffs. Brussels absorbed a portion of redirected African exports, quietly signaling that it would not follow Washington into isolation. The hesitation was subtle but telling. Western unity was no longer assured. On the African continent, regional organizations responded with mixed tones. The African Union praised the spirit of sovereignty, but avoided direct confrontation with Washington. ECOWAS, torn between internal divisions and external pressures, urged dialogue while privately acknowledging the symbolic weight of Burkina Faso's stand. Official statements were cautious, but public sentiment was clear. Traore had tapped into a continent-wide hunger for dignity. Beyond Africa, the multipolar world wasted no time in filling the vacuum. China expanded purchasing agreements and offered currency swaps, shielding African economies from dollar dependence. Russia stepped in with gold refiners and security guarantees, tying strategic resources directly to Moscow's orbit. India absorbed agricultural surpluses, strengthening its own food security while providing an outlet for African farmers. Even Brazil, often underestimated, drew on cultural and historical ties to create new bilateral channels for cash crops and staples. What tied these responses together was not charity, but necessity. For Beijing, African minerals remain indispensable. For Moscow, African gold provides financial insulation against sanctions. For New Delhi, African agriculture feeds a population of over 1 billion. For Brasilia, African partnerships secure influence across the South Atlantic. Each player acted from interest, yet their combined presence created what commentators began calling the shield of multipolarity. This shield mattered most for perception. If the United States believed tariffs could isolate Africa, the rapid embrace of alternative partners proved the opposite. Isolation had become almost impossible in a world where Africa had more suitors than suppressors, and this realization did more damage to Washington's credibility than any lost trade volume. For analysts, the symbolism was undeniable. The Burkina Faso revolution was not a literal uprising, but a geopolitical rebalancing. A small state had demonstrated that sovereignty could be defended if alternative alliances were cultivated. That precedent unsettled Western capitals. It raised the question of whether larger African states, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, might soon follow suit, emboldened by the knowledge that defiance did not equal destruction. And so the world watched with admiration or unease as a nation once dismissed as peripheral stood at the center of a shifting order. And the question loomed larger. What path lay ahead for Africa itself? The dust of defiance had settled, but the path ahead remained uncertain. For Burkina Faso, rejecting tariffs was not the end of a story, but the beginning of one. The immediate future was a battlefield of possibilities, opportunity on one side, retaliation on the other. The risks were clear. Washington still had tools at its disposal. Sanctions could be sharpened, aid withdrawn, diplomatic ties frozen. Allies could be pressured to close their markets. Financial institutions could tighten credit. The United States had long relied on fear, the fear of isolation, the fear of collapse. If that fear could be reignited, the precedent set by Traore might yet be undone. And yet, for every risk, there was an equal opportunity. Multipolarity was no longer theory, but practice. The coalition of 34 nations proved that Africa could stand as more than a collection of vulnerable states. Trade flows to Asia, partnerships with Russia, support from India and Brazil, cautious engagement from Europe. All these had created a web strong enough to resist one nation's pressure. If that web held, then Africa would no longer be a pawn, but a partner in global commerce. For Burkina Faso itself, the challenge was to turn symbolism into substance. Pride could not replace bread, and sovereignty could not remain a slogan. Policies of self-sufficiency in agriculture, control over mining assets, and investment in local industries would have to deepen. If Traore could transform resistance into reform, then his refusal would be remembered not just as a moment of defiance, but as the spark of a transformation. The broader question, though, was continental. Would larger states take the cue? Would Nigeria leverage its oil wealth with greater independence? Would South Africa, a BRICS heavyweight, rely more fully on alternative financial channels? Would Kenya expand its ties with Asia without hesitation? If Burkina Faso's defiance was the first domino, then the chain reaction could redraw the global map. This is the fragile but hopeful road that lies ahead. It is not smooth. It is not safe. But it carries within it the promise that Africa can finally write its own terms. For centuries, the continent has been cast as the periphery, exploited, lectured, silenced. Now it has the chance to stand at the center of its own story. The question that lingers is not whether the old order will push back. It will. The question is whether Africa will stand united long enough for the new order to take root. And that question leads us to the final chapter. The meaning of this defiance, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the future of Africa itself. History often remembers not the size of nations, but the size of their choices. When Ibrahim Traoré stood before the tariffs of Donald Trump and said no, he was not merely negotiating trade. He was challenging the architecture of control that had defined Africa's place in the world for centuries. In that moment, the so-called periphery became the center, and the small became mighty. What mattered was not the percentage points of lost exports, but the principle reclaimed: sovereignty is not for sale. The Ibrahim Traoré coup, once dismissed by critics as reckless, has now evolved into a doctrine, a defiant insistence that dignity must weigh more than dependency. And the resonance of that doctrine is spreading across Africa like fire across dry grass. The symbolism cannot be overstated. Burkina Faso, without oil like Nigeria, without the industrial power of South Africa, without the strategic weight of Egypt, nevertheless shifted the balance of perception. It proved that courage could outweigh size, that unity could blunt pressure, and that multipolarity was no longer a slogan but a shield. This is why observers have begun calling it the Burkina Faso Revolution, not because of barricades in the streets, but because a continent-long silence has found its voice. Yet the future remains unwritten. America may retaliate. Europe may waver. Africa's coalition may fracture under strain. But the fear that once paralyzed leaders has been broken. And when fear collapses, the chains it supported collapse with it. So what comes next? That depends not only on Traoré, but on every African leader watching. If this moment is seized, it could mark the dawn of a century in which Africa is no longer lectured, but listened to, no longer dictated to, but dealing on equal terms. If this story resonates with your sense of justice, do not look away. Subscribe, comment, and share, because the more voices join, the stronger this message becomes. The world has seen the courage of one young leader. The question it now asks is simple: who will be next?